Welcome, everyone, to Dolls of Our Lives. This is the podcast where we're reliving the American Girl series book by book. I'm Mary.
I'm Allison.
And on the Patreon today, we're going to be talking about a book called Toxic: Women, Fame, and the Tabloid 2000s, which sounds scary, but it'll be a fun conversation. But before we get into that, how are you doing, Allison?
I'm doing great. This book is about 9 women who really went through it in the early 2000s, and my experience in high school and college is extremely tame. Like, my whole life is very uninteresting compared to these 9 women.
Okay, wow. That's a big swing.
It's good in a good way.
Yeah. I mean, the things these women have been through are absolutely, I mean, this was a tough read in a sense because it was just like every chapter you're like, oh my God, like, I can't believe this happened to them. Like, this is terrible.
I also didn't think there were this many single name stars that you could write about from the early 2000s. To me, there's not that many kind of one name, one note people, but she takes us through Britney, Paris, Lindsay, Aaliyah, Janet, Amy, Kim, China, and Jen. A few of those you could think of multiple people, but when you know it's the early 2000s, you know the Lindsay we're talking about.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think the only ones where I was like, who is, I guess Amy, but I mean, I guess if you know it's early 2000s, that kind of clarifies it. But yeah, it was a truly wild ride. I know you've taken in another, I don't know if doctored is the word, but, you know, creative work by one of the stars of this book.
Yeah, our people's princess, Lindsay Lohan, plays a character called Maddie Kelly in the book Irish Wish. And this film has gotten a lot of, I would say, hypercritical feedback. People really kind of making fun of this movie. I thought it was delightful. I really liked it. I think in a big Netflix world, this would have been in theaters and people would have made it a night to go out and see it.
I believe that. I mean, I've seen the preview. I still haven't watched it yet. I'm working my way up to it, but it looks like something I would have gone to see in the 2000s in the theater. Like, I used to go to the movies all the time on a Friday night. I mean, my life feels so removed from that. I don't know if it's the pandemic that changed that or what, but I definitely would have gone to see something like this. I probably have seen like 5 things like this.
There's a sense, that people don't want to be forced to go to the movie theater, but I think Barbie and other films, right, when Marvel comes out with anything, we want a reason to feel like we want to be at the movie theater. And several people said to me, like, I would have loved to go see this at the movies because it would feel like an event. The premise is that a woman is effectively a ghostwriter for someone for whom she's just supposed to be an editor. And he's made it big, and she's about to confess her feelings for him when he falls in love with someone else. And her one wish is to marry him. And the rest of the movie is kind of that unraveling. It's like perfect Lindsay Lohan.
Wow. It feels like it's teed up for all of her strengths, which is like hijinks, a lot of great face work, some very good comedy work.
Mishaps,
feelings, that kind of thing. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know why people are coming down so hard against it. I know the New Yorker, I think, had some like crazy headline that's like, this is the proof of a dystopian, like something. And I was like, what?
I think it's actually a very simple, very silly romance movie that has just enough depth to keep you interested. But I saw a lot of criticisms that it was probably written by AI, that there wasn't enough kind of humanity to it. And I was like, no, this is the perfect amount of humanity. A person has to choose between 2 very attractive people and make a hard choice. That's it.
Wow. Yeah, and I wonder, too, if it's like the reaction is it almost seems uncanny because of the events, like global events of the past few years. I almost feel like everyone's so jaded or unhappy or something. But with this, it's like, this is very straightforward. It is what it says it is. And people are like, this sucks. And it's just kind of like, is it because we're all too jaded?
I think this movie also winks at what Lindsay Lohan knows people have said about her for the past at least 5 or 10 years. And I think part of what this movie puts forward is, it just presents her as a successful woman who wants to be in love, who wants to marry someone that she really cares about. And so she makes this wish. She's in a beautiful setting. The scene that's kind of made the rounds on the internet is when she's on the cliffs of Moher and she says that her favorite author is James Joyce. And it's kind of a cheeky moment because that is no one's favorite author, probably.
Right.
And her love interest is very surprised by this. And Lindsay Lohan's character just absolutely doubles down in the best possible way. And I think it's looking at us and saying, you know, someone like Lindsay Lohan can love Ulysses.
Wow. That's kind of deep. You know what I mean?
I think it is. I thought it was a great movie.
Right, you're selling me on it. I want to watch it. The one thing I saw this past weekend, I got a shingles vaccine and it like absolutely knocked me out for days. But it happened just in time for the new season of Girls 5 Eva. Have you watched that?
I have watched the first season. Yeah.
It's so good. Oh my God. In the third season, they just moved all of it to Netflix. And it's so funny. I don't know. It's just like very kind of like this movie sounds like it is what it is. It says it is. It's not that deep. It's funny. The songs are catchy, and, you know, it just brought me joy in a way. It's sort of like a throwback kind of vibey show. It's always like, because it's nostalgizing, like when they were a hot girl group during the millennial, like early aughts during the same time as this book.
Now, this book, one of the other subtitles that I saw, and so the author lives in London, and it seems as if there was a British release and an American release. There is in the subtitle of one version of this book the phrase "the naughties," which is like naughty
What?
early aughts. Have you heard this before?
No. Is this like an accepted phrase?
I'm wondering if it's more of an English phrase because my hardcover book that I got is bright pink with bright green lettering that says toxic all over it. And my subtitle is Women, Fame, and the Tabloid 2000s. Whereas an earlier version of this book that just came out last year was going to be called Upskirt Decade, Women, Fame, and the Naughties.
Wow. That's interesting. And you kind of have to wonder what happened that they made that change.
I think Upskirt Decade, I'm curious about that decision. I think Toxic, perhaps for an American audience more so. You open a book called Toxic about the early 2000s and you know chapter 1 is about Britney Spears.
As it should be. But I mean, isn't Britney global? Like, I don't know. Maybe I'm just too defensive of her, but I'm like, shouldn't we all know who that is?
I feel like Upskirt Decade and the phrase naughties feels more like it would fit on the cover of a British rag than an American tabloid.
I agree with that 100%. I think they're more invested in like cheeky titles in a sense.
Yes.
You know, whereas like if you look at page 6, it's like the titles make absolutely no sense and they don't care because they're just like, you know, it's about speed, not about wit in a sense. But do you want to get into this book?
Yeah, I'll give folks a little bit. We mentioned the women before and we'll go through it again, but I want to give people just kind of some background from the publisher's summary, which is welcome to celebrity culture in the early aughts, the reign of Perez Hilton, celebrity sex tapes, and dueling tabloids fed by paparazzi willing to do anything to get the shot. The internet was still the Wild West. Slut-shaming, fat-shaming, and revenge porn were all fair game, and celebrity was seen as a commodity to be consumed. And for the famous women of this era, they were never as popular or as vulnerable as when they were in a crisis.
And I think an interesting piece of this book is that in the introduction, she talks about how she decided to define the time period that she was going to cover, because something I was kind of wondering about is like, a lot of the stuff she describes is pretty bad and in some ways specific to the time, but a lot of the through lines and themes are things that are still happening now. So like if you're writing a history of this, how do you decide when to start it and when to stop it? And that's something that like a lot of historians have to think about. If you're studying like basically anything, you'll have someone say like, well, when do you decide to start, like where do you decide to end the US survey class and begin part 2 and all this other stuff? So she says in this book, it begins in 1998 with the release of Britney's debut, Baby One More Time, and ends with the feminist backlash to Robin Thicke's single, Blurred Lines, in 2013. History does not always fit within neat parameters.
This book has one of the most interesting uses of a timeline that I've ever seen. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about this because one of my nephews is in AP US history, right? So he was given this kind of laundry list of terms and dates and things that he needed to know around 1919 because he's learning about the Red Scare. And I had this vision of a student in the future getting ready to write their document-based question with this timeline.
It's funny that you say that because like 2-3 days ago, I was on TikTok and I saw an AP US history teacher talking about a strategy she uses to kind of ground the kids when they come back from break and are like, we forgot everything we learned in the fall. And her idea was like, I give every table a list of years, including 1919. And I asked them to think like, what are the big historical events associated with that year? And it starts with like 1865. And literally the last year on her timeline was 2016.
Oh.
And everyone in the comments was like, I was not emotionally prepared for you to let me know that 2016 is taught in AP US history.
It makes sense. And I know when we were first learning about teaching history, there was a lot of conversation over how do you actually get to the point where you're able to teach about post 9/11 world wars. And a lot of people felt that they didn't have the time to even get to Persian Gulf before. So I actually think it's positive, right? You know, if you're growing up in the aughts that you're getting this history, but I know that we almost never got there.
Yeah, I mean, I know when I was in AP US history, I think we got to the beginning of World War II, and that was it. Like, we didn't really get that far.
Also, you know, of note, right? So between 97 and 98 is when Mattel acquires American Girl, and this book starts with September 1998, Baby One More Time, and kind of like the world flare signal that sent off. And I have such visceral memories of hearing that song and watching that song on MTV as a music video for the first time. And I also remember what I was doing the summer Blurred Lines came out and just hearing it on my car radio over and over. Both of those feel very far away from the world that we live in now.
I think that's definitely true. I mean, Blurred Lines feels a lot longer ago than apparently it was. So I was surprised to read what year it came out. I didn't realize it was 2013. But I just remember when that song came out, everyone was playing it at their wedding, like at their reception. I was like, like, honestly, if you listen to the words, it's kind of obvious what it's about. So it's sort of strange how people embrace that song.
And I think this author, she's a journalist. I think she makes a great point that, you know, the best way to know that the party is over is you turn the lights on. And I think she makes this argument that that was kind of people turning the lights on for this extended party that goes like pre 9/11 to early post 9/11 through this kind of celebrity culture around these women like Perez Hilton, that the party had really ended because people chose to be upset openly about that song, right? Like things that had bothered people. This premise of the upskirt decade, she's interested in the fact that women who were famous lost a lot of privacy, but also ordinary women were being targeted by all these new kinds of technology and internet, and just sort of like that everyone seemed to be losing from this. And then Blurred Lines gets this huge backlash.
Yeah, and I want to get into that. I think, like, as you know, it's really a history of technology. I mean, she says that in another description of kind of the timeline she's interested in, it's about the passage of the internet from novelty to utility. And I think that's a really helpful way of thinking about the change that she's marking through the stories of these celebrity women, because it's not just the story, as she notes, of celebrity women, but of, you know, so-called like ordinary women like us who end up having their privacy violated. And the laws essentially have not caught up with the technology, and the protections just don't exist. And the laws we have end up protecting, in these cases, abusers or people who are violating women's privacy. So she starts the book, and it could have been called Upskirt Photo or whatever you said, because it's about this anecdote from 2006. I didn't know this story. Did you know this story before this book?
No, I did not.
So she talks about a man named Ricardo Ferrante who in 2006 goes to a Target and essentially takes out a camera and takes an upskirt photo of a girl in the greeting card section. And then security thankfully arrest him, or they find him. And but it goes to trial, I think, in 2007. And a judge ordered that the charges against Ferrante be dismissed on the grounds that the person who photographed was not in a place where she had a reasonable expectation of privacy. And an appeals court confirmed that the next year. So basically, as she notes, by being in a public space, the girl was understood to have made the most intimate parts of her body available to anyone who cared to look.
And if you remember seeing tabloid photographs in the early 2000s, it was a frequent occurrence that you would see celebrities like Britney Spears, like Perez Hilton, like Lindsay Lohan, and also, people who hung out with them, like Nicole Richie, like as if the camera was always just missing a truly kind of graphic or pornographic angle. I will say I did not know about that trial. Going to a school where we wore skirts to school, I knew people this happened to, and we were warned about where and how to wear our school skirt outside of school.
Wow, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I was sort of roughly aware that there were some creepy guys who did this kind of thing, but what was really shocking to me, and I'm sure to the poor victim of this, is that, I think sometimes people think, well, I'm being treated unfairly, but if the authorities knew about it, then this person would be held to account. And it's like this, everything happened that should have happened. He was arrested, he was brought to trial, and then our legal system essentially put the blame on her, or just said, like, even just by being in public, you've opened yourself up or kind of granted permission to be treated this way. It's still shocking just to talk about it now.
There's, I think, I always find it really interesting, right? Like when people are able to put quotes at the beginning of their book. And I think this author chose two amazing ones to put up against each other. And I know this probably sounds like I'm doing a book report and I only read the first 5 pages because that's what I'm pulling from. But I think this part of the book is really smart. She has a quote from Perez Hilton, who's been contrite at some points, but also unapologetic at others about what he reported on with celebrities. And he says, "I didn't feel bad because they were rich and famous and knew what they were signing up for." And that's a quote from 2011. And that's paired with a quote from David Bowie from 1999, where he says, "I don't think we've even seen the tip of the iceberg. I think the potential of what the internet is going to do, both good and bad, is unimaginable. We're actually on the cusp of something exhilarating and terrifying. It's an alien life form."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that juxtaposition says it all. And I think, to move into the first chapter, so she kind of builds a bridge from the first case, or this reported case of the upskirt photo and the lack of protection for the victim of that, to then Perez Hilton and, of course, her sex tape, which is the thing for which I think a lot of people, or the thing with which many people associated her in the early 2000s. I know that when I was in high school, I remember people talking about this, her sex tape. I've never seen it, but I remember then she went on The Simple Life not long after that.
This book also made me think about, now I think it happens on like podcasts, which people record and put on YouTube. The amount of just sort of like knowingly and winkingly like creepy shows that were around, right, that served a certain kind of audience, like Howard Stern, who I know is still around, but like the way that cable used to kind of serve that function. And one of the most brilliant parts of this book is making this argument that with the rise of the internet, people didn't want to just be able to send instant messages or emails to people. They didn't want it just as like correspondence. They wanted video, they wanted data, and they also wanted pornographic material. And her timeline just so brilliantly talks about like these important moments. I just kind of want to run through these dates because I think it's helpful if you lived through it to see how tight this timeline is. MySpace is from 2003. Facebook is from 2004. Perez Hilton, his website, and page 666 is from 2004 as well. TMZ is 2005. Twitter is 2006. 2007 is Keeping Up with the Kardashians. There's the crash in 2008. And Instagram is from 2010.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, it's all in this window of time that she's talking about.
There's a moment in this book where someone says, like, if you can believe people are spending, X amount of time on MySpace a week. And now that is a very small fraction of the amount of time that the average TikTok user spends on that app every single day. Like, that's how much it's changed in a 15 to 20 year window.
Yeah, and it's crazy. And I mean, part of that, I'm sure, is because we have it on our phones now. And I was just telling like some college students now about, my first cell phone and how it was a flip phone and there was no internet on it and nothing like that. And they were sort of amazed, but I, in a sense preferred that. It was easier and you weren't as drawn into it. But now I think, there's so much internet available to you at your literal fingertips. You don't have to jockey for time at the family computer.
No, and there's a moment in this book, and I don't mean to keep jumping around. We can go back into Paris because I think there's great things there, but I never knew that the connection between some of these things was this direct. In the wake of the incident between Janet Jackson and Justin Timberlake at the Super Bowl, there is someone who was watching. He was a programmer named Jawed Karim, and it says he was one of the millions searching for a video of Janet's humiliation. He'd been struck by how difficult it was to find and watch, and he's the person who launches YouTube.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was surprised by that too, that like YouTube was basically inspired by someone who wanted to see Janet Jackson's boobs at the Super Bowl. Like, that's insane.
And I knew that aspects of the internet came to rise because people wanted easier access. This was something that Pamela Lee recently talked about in a documentary about her life, that actually gave rise to more demand for internet capacity, just people wanting to watch her video. I think when you read this book, if this is something you're curious about, like your own life experience, it gives you a real frame for just how pervasive this was. That with Perez Hilton, like she was in on the joke of the simple life. She was in on the joke of her own reality TV. She knew what kind of made for camp. I think Jessica Simpson has made a great case for this as well. What she didn't consent to was the way that people filmed her, and that she was kind of forced to accept that as okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think I remember at the time with Paris Hilton and then later Kim Kardashian, when her sex tape came out, people would try to malign both of them by saying, well, they're profiting off of it. But what actually had happened was that someone else like sold the tape. They were unable to keep it, block it from the marketplace. And as this author points out, Kim Kardashian did try to legally block any sale or distribution of the tape. But when that failed, when the legal system essentially failed them, then they had to kind of just accept as a consolation prize, like claiming it as property from which they could profit. And so everyone has framed this story as like, oh, well, they were in on it and they were in on the joke and they're just like literally leaking a porn tape to be famous. But that's not what happened. But even in the telling of that story, people are more likely to believe a telling that frames them as villain, not victim.
There's also a time where Paris Hilton, and if you remember this famously, right, like Khloe Kardashian, there was a number of famous women who committed either kind of small, petty, or like serious crimes, right, depending on the person. And they had these very public reckonings. And this author makes the argument that, the public was, quote, not content with seeing her undressed. It seems to be assumed that we need to watch her being punished and humiliated as well.
Yeah, this was a rough chapter. I mean, they're all rough chapters in the book in the sense of just like what these women were up against. What did you think about when they bring Sex and the City into the Paris Hilton chapter?
I found that this chapter was one where, and it's an important disclaimer about this whole book, that this author is saying, like, I'm talking about the image of these people. I am not trying to tell just a simple biography. I'm trying to think about this. What kept going through my mind with this entire section of the book was the fact that when I've heard Paris be reflective about her own experience, her trauma from being truly like kidnapped and sent away to a center for, like people who are struggling with their teen years, I think has so completely changed the way that I see her. And it's like, those women on Sex and the City are characters, and Paris Hilton is a real person. That's not really answering your question, but I think this chapter was one where, like, I've learned so many new things about Paris Hilton that was kind of bothering me. So I was like, well, actually, we've gotten new data on her, and I see her very differently now.
Yeah, I mean, I think the author ends that chapter by saying she's effectively reemerged as like businesswoman Paris. Like that's how she's reframed her image by using the documentary and other things to kind of reframe her narrative, not only as a victim of real trauma for the school she was sent to and the experiences she had there and the sex tape and everything, but also as someone who, was savvy enough to see in that moment in the early 2000s that people wanted to see celebrities succeed, but also took some perverse thrill in seeing them brought low, as she writes. So that, by acknowledging the moments where she screwed up, like weirdly, that was a way of navigating this, PR moment in her life. But the Sex and the City episode that she talks about is one where essentially Samantha is dating someone who is taping women without their knowledge when he has sex with them. And she becomes aware of this and is waiting to see if he's going to tape her, and he doesn't. And she's like offended by it and is like, wait, stop. I want you to tape us having sex, because she gets a thrill off of it, or wants the kind of cachet of being a woman that someone would want to tape a sexual encounter with, which is sort of the inverse of what really happened to Paris and Kim Kardashian.
I very recently rewatched that episode and was pretty horrified by it, actually.
Right.
And part of it is Carrie, the character Carrie, her sort of nonstop issue with not being able to get over her boyfriend, Big, who's always dating models. And a lot of this is sort of, this is what models deserve. Like, this is what models get. And there's a line right before that section where the author says, all that money, all that status, and she still couldn't stop you from seeing her naked. Which I think was kind of the point, right? It made people who didn't have much else in life feel like they were superior to a Hilton. And Carrie and her friends, who are these beautiful, successful, and fairly affluent women for the most part, they feel that way too. Like, you're invited into that gaze and into that perspective through the show.
Right. And also they like, it's interesting or like horrifying that they don't have a problem with what this guy is doing. They're not horrified by it ultimately, or like how it might be impacting other women, or like their lack of privacy. And, I think that's like an important piece of this, which is that it's not only men preying on women. It's like society is allowing the treatment of these public women in this kind of similar way. I also thought it was interesting that she draws the comparison, or like, that Perez Hilton was ultimately jealous that Paris Hilton was able to survive the aughts of fame and kind of rebrand herself and relaunch, whereas he is in many ways a casualty, deservedly so, of this era of tabloids.
Absolutely. I think there's been a sufficient backlash against him, right? And Paris has kind of made herself the original Me Too, or like the original, sorry, I had another page open, the original influencer. I should say there is one mention of her time at the Provo Canyon School in this, but I think if you are interested in her story, like, I think she does such a good job at talking about her own experiences. And we've now read so many different things of people kind of talking back against folks' perception of them, which I don't think means this is an invaluable book. I think there's a lot that's valuable here, but I think it's kind of cracking open a door, and we may need to wait another 20 years to get the Lindsay Lohan autobiography, but I would happily read it.
Oh yeah, I would love to read her book. I can't even imagine what that would be. I mean, I think reading this chapter, I had a lot of empathy for her, because this is a person whose parents were like wildly irresponsible and like basically modeling how to behave badly in public, or like court fame, or, payments or something for like monetizing any kind of family trauma.
Yeah.
And that was
dark. This chapter also kind of sheds a new light on, this reality that, like, we know very well. We've seen it now with a number of people, that the transition from Disney star to not Disney star is extremely harrowing. And one thing that's mentioned in this chapter is her appearance on Saturday Night Live, when they make her sort of like hot Hermione. And I just remember seeing these people over and over, and it really was this culture of just teeing these people up like, you are supposed to ogle them. Like, that is sort of the purpose of these people. And I think that cluster fits very well with Britney, Paris, Lindsay, and Kim, and not necessarily with other people in this book, but the extent to which that really, like, it's not saying too much that in kind of the post 9/11 world, which she invokes quite a bit, that all of this media, it was like all of human civilization has led up to this point where you can stare at Lindsay Lohan.
Yeah, it's very strange. And the mention of SNL is interesting, because I feel like that's still a place where they invoke or like invite young female hosts, and then like all they're given to like work with content wise is like, you're hot.
Sydney Sweeney.
And Sydney Sweeney, I was just going to say, like, that's what just happened to her. What was that, like 2-3 weeks ago? And, it's amazing that they just have, like, as an institution, such an incredible lack of self-awareness. And I was actually thinking, when she was writing about that Lindsay Lohan moment, of when the Olsen twins were on, and Chris Parnell was like, like he had a running clock of like when they turned 18, and everyone laughed, and I was just like, I remember watching it and being like, this is gross, like this is so like nasty. And I mean, in a way, if you think about them with Lindsay, they were so smart in a way compared to all these women to just leave, you know, like they just clocked out and were like, we're going to go to fashion, which is still very public. But by being behind the scenes, I think it's bought them some measure of autonomy. I mean, people are still obsessed with them, but it seems different.
There's also this truth that, you know, Lindsay Lohan very much got the message that people were done with her, right? And you've seen this with a number of especially young female celebrities, and it does happen to male celebrities as well. There's kind of this oversaturation into their content, and then nothing they do, right, seems to measure up. And it's really quite sad. There's a lot of comparisons in here to Marilyn Monroe. The same thing has been happening to Sydney Sweeney as well. Where there's kind of this thing of like, it really seemed for a period of time like Lindsay Lohan was so out of control. It's talked about in here that there was the quote imminent possibility of her death. And I remember this. I remember kind of seeing like post the death of Princess Diana, right? Like these chases, right? And the way that this was this really kind of insane adrenaline seeking pack of people just like chasing these women down.
Yeah, I mean, it's gross to think about the ways that these women and a lot of celebrities are hunted. And I remember thinking that too, reading Spare. I mean, he describes that in great detail, like the lengths you have to go to try to avoid encountering paparazzi just in daily life. And I can't, you know, as I was reading this book, it was really hard to kind of imagine what that would feel like day to day.
Now, there's something else that comes up quite a bit in this book that kind of has to do with body image, which is the really open fat phobic culture that a lot of this was percolating in, and especially with the way that reality TV shows and particularly contest-based shows like American Idol, just constantly there were people being talked about as fat and chubby and being criticized for these things, right? The assumption that that was not going to work within the industry. And then Kim Kardashian kind of subverting some of that according to the book. Did this kind of make you think about reality TV that you watched 20 years ago differently, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think for sure there's been a change in how we think about body image, and I've actually been thinking a lot about, when I was reading the book, I was thinking about The Biggest Loser, which I don't think would fly now, or I hope it wouldn't, where, I mean, literally they're gamifying how they can transform fat people to be thin, with thinness equated with winning or like health or success. In a lot of ways, there's been a lot of like longitudinal studies of these people that they're not healthy after the show, and that, you know, it was a really bad environment. But more recently, I've been thinking about Oprah and this whole Ozempic situation. And, you know, I'm a big reader of like the Burnt Toast newsletter, which has great things to say about body positivity and body issues. But Oprah just had to step down from the board of Weight Watchers because she had to admit publicly that she's been taking Ozempic. But I mean, to me, that was one of the biggest influences on me growing up, was watching her show and seeing her constant discussion of weight and really of like serious fat phobia about herself, but about the culture generally, and seeing how trapped she was by it and how desperate she was to be thin. And, you know, it's just, I was reflecting a lot on that because her show was still on in these years, and I think was one of many influences that really shamed or demonized people who were fat.
I saw something, and I honestly don't know where I saw it. I think it's something multiple people have been saying, but it kind of struck a chord with me in such an immediate way. And it said something like, can you imagine how the past 30 or so years might be different if Oprah Winfrey was happy being fat? Just how different conversations could have been. And I attended a live show for Kate Kennedy. She does a tour around her book, One in a Millennial. And she showed photos of Lindsay Lohan, Britney Spears, Perez Hilton, all these people around these years. And she does this kind of part in her show, and it's in her book as well, but kind of talking about like, we didn't stand a chance. And she shows photos side by side where they hired doctors to speculate on how many pounds these women weighed. And within matters of weeks, they would vacillate between, these women are so hot, this is the peak of femininity, these women are perfect, they're the perfect weight, to either diagnosing them with an eating disorder or calling them fat.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's like a lose-lose. Like, these women had no chance. And by extension, none of us had a chance in terms of like the things that were prized as beautiful or healthy were completely unattainable and not healthy at all. And yeah, I mean, that line about, God, what if Oprah accepted herself or loved herself as a fat woman? Like, that would have been incredible. Like, can you imagine if the most influential woman in the country was like actually not doing crazy diet shows and, you know, actually just saying affirming things about herself?
There's also something I think that's extremely valuable in this book, and I've heard people talking about this more, which is there is a chapter on Amy Winehouse and the way that she struggled living with an eating disorder, and she had substance abuse disorder, and the way that Amy Winehouse, you know, was a very prime example of someone who was criticized for her body, developed an eating disorder, had a very hard time with just like the way that she was represented. This was a very like open thing, right, in Britain at the time. And the kind of whiplash that if you grew up in this culture trying to keep track, right? Like, I get bombarded with body acceptance ads, and I don't know why. I'm sure it's some token of my data that's been sold. I see a minimum of 5 Ozempic ads every single day. And if I'm not seeing Ozempic ads, I'm seeing ads for the knockoffs like that people are making. Like, it is actually a nonstop part of my life. And I have to wonder, like, what piece of my data, like, is it my Fitbit? Like, who told people, right, that I should be getting this targeted? And I have said many times, like, don't show me this. I don't want to see this. It really kind of, to me, like, I'm not saying that this author says it's an isolated period of time. This has just mutated, right? Like, the way that Amy Winehouse's eating disorder was so discussed, now it's like people basically being accused of taking Ozempic on live TV.
I think there's that, but I also think I sort of take issue with this book saying there's an end point on the timeline, because I actually don't think it ever ended. I think, as you say, it's mutated. And for me, the mutation is not, you know, women living their lives and people outside of their lives speculating about what they're doing to their bodies, either to make it closer to the ideal or the ways it's fallen from it. But rather, people, the stars themselves are expected to perform a level of health that is not credible. And I think that's similar to what's happened in the early aughts. But I'm thinking about somebody like Mindy Kaling. And whether or not she's taken Ozempic, there's been a dramatic change in her appearance. And instead of just owning that maybe that was part of the journey there, which, again, her body, her choice, but I would respect her more if she was like, hey, you know what? I'm a person of privilege. I made the decision to go on this drug because I wanted to be thin for whatever reason, and that's how I got here. But instead, she does all this content where she's like, no, it's just like, I eat differently. I just eat healthy food, and I go for hikes with my kids. And Oprah was saying, when she finally was forced to admit it, she said, I use it as a maintenance drug, which is a lie. And that's not how people use it. It's like, first of all, it's for people who are diabetic, but I would respect people more who make this choice if they were open about it. But I think part of the toxicity is that the culture is not only that you must be thin, but that you must hide the means by which you've become thin if it's not, air quotes, natural to you.
Do you think that this book places a lot of weight, I think mostly rightly, on the impact of Me Too becoming both a celebrity moment and a mainstream moment, right? Coming from a world of Black female activism, right? Coming from grassroots activism to being something that celebrities particularly were taking on. What do you kind of make of her assessment of that as changing culture?
I mean, I don't want to be a pessimist, but I don't know that it has changed culture. I think with a lot of these things, what ends up happening is it becomes more insidious and just better hidden. And I think it was effectual in the sense of, you know, causing real change for the victims of people like Harvey Weinstein in very powerful roles. I think that was real. And I hope that it's caused, some kind of change in a trickle down effect. Whether it has or not, I can't say for sure. But for me, it's like, if I watch movies that are being produced or TV shows or books that come out or the ways that celebrities are talked about in culture, which I think is a fair barometer of like, broader feelings about things in culture, I don't really know that I'm seeing that much change. I mean, I don't want to keep talking about him, but I think Justin Timberlake is an interesting case in this regard. Like, this man has been allowed to have so many comeback attempts. I think in part because we're, as a culture, really not that upset by anything that he's done. I mean, I am, but I mean, generally speaking.
I think that maybe the sins, right, are not punished culturally, right? I also think that the idea of canceling a person, which again came from like a very specific tradition of Black activism, has now become almost meaningless. I think that the way that it's so overused, it just doesn't actually, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but the way that has been so diluted, right? It's like everyone is not a narcissist. If someone tricks you once, they are not gaslighting you, right? Like, these terms have become so pervasive and overused that they don't have the power that maybe they could have in another time.
Well, and I think cancel, if it specifically has been co-opted by conservatives or people against whom it's been deployed and reimagined as, almost like a part of their victimhood, when in fact, no one was saying you can't work again, in the case of some of these people in the public light. But I think it's like people were trying to invite some consequences into some of these folks' lives for their behavior and have some accountability. And instead people were like, oh my God, you're trying to cancel me and all this stuff. And it's like, that's not, I think, what anyone was trying to do. I think they were trying to have an open conversation about accountability and consequences. And I don't see that has actually become mainstream. Like, instead you have people like Dave Chappelle claiming that cancellation as victimhood and weaponizing it again and again against trans people, and frankly unfunny and really gross jokes in his act.
I would agree, unfunny, right? It's like, there's a lot of people now who are making a career out of like, I almost got canceled, which is not terribly interesting.
They're weaponizing it as some part of their imagined victimhood. Like, oh, people tried to cancel me. When in fact, somebody actually just confronted you with the truth of your behavior and asked you to be accountable for it. And rather than actually sit with that, it becomes like yet again another layer of their imagined victimhood. So I think what's missing here is like a lack of broad empathy for other people's experiences. Like, I think with Janet Jackson, who's the subject of a chapter in this book, I keep thinking about what all the things that have happened to her and the grace with which she has navigated all of these various things, where it's like she has had real consequences in her career for things that she did not do. And I think that's where I have no sympathy for Justin Timberlake, who time and again had opportunities not to accept consequences for his actions, but to acknowledge, his accountability. Like, yeah, I was part of this too. And I just want to acknowledge that, like, my career isn't ended, but hers was on pause for like 20 years because of this snafu. And that's not fair.
In the descriptions for this book, I think this is like a critical point that this author tries to balance, presenting these women, quote, neither as pure victims nor as conniving strategists, but as complex individuals trying to navigate celebrity while under attack from a vicious and fast-changing media. And part of why I brought up the fact that YouTube comes out of people trying to see the footage of Janet Jackson's humiliation is there is a rate at which these women's humiliating moments was being consumed that you cannot compare to anyone else in history. Because not only was it so intense and so amplified and magnified, it also was unprecedented.
I think that's really true. And I think in some ways, this is a history about why we need regulation, because like you're saying, without any regulation of this technology as it was evolving from a novelty to a utility, to use her phrase, you can see that the people who are most victimized by it are the most vulnerable people in our society. So women, people of color, queer people, etc. Like, these are the people whose humiliations become like early vines on YouTube, all of these things. And there's no recourse still, really, to rein in any of these platforms. I think that's what's stunning to me is like she picks 2013 as the endpoint of her book. But we still have all of these social media platforms. Like, how is it that we're relying on Elon Musk's and like the better angels of his nature to rein in Nazis on X? Like, that's insane to me. Like, when you don't have any kind of regulation, these are the kinds of things that can happen.
I think sadly, though, this book focuses on grown women, and there's a lot of critical points. I think Lindsay is kind of, and Britney are the youngest in like the formative years where they were very popular. I think something that is different now is there's an introduction in this book around the advent of YouTube of the fact that Justin Bieber couldn't have existed and become famous in the way he had in any other time. And I see so many children being exploited on the internet, on apps every single day. And I think a future version of this book will look back in horror at how children were, quote, a commodity to be consumed on the internet, like using her phrasing about women in the early 2000s. But it will be entirely about children, right? It will be about like famous vloggers, children, and them looking back, because you're starting to see it come out. You're starting to see that backlash. But I think when a whole cohort of these people, like I'm thinking of a few children who are prominent on TikTok, I think the rage that people will feel when there's a little bit more perspective will be a parallel to this culture of exploitation.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, I just saw an article the other day that was about like, a person who grew up being in their parents' influencer videos was like, so what am I being paid? Like, they got to an age where they could actually ask, like, and what will I be making off of these videos? And the parents were writing into one of these advice columns being like, what do I say to them to explain that you don't earn anything here? And I'm like, I don't know if that's the question. Like, I think this is like a child labor crisis in the making.
But you think about, right, so there's a really precarious balance here. And there's later chapters about China, who is a wrestling star, and then Jennifer Aniston. And part of the whole kind of take that she has on Jennifer Aniston is like her lack of children is what makes her appear to be sad and both this like highly successful and yet like failed woman because she's not a mother. But all along, right, like no matter what chapter you're reading, I should exclude Aaliyah because she is a child for most of the coverage that is talked about in this book and things that happen in her kind of rise to stardom. These are still people who are making adult choices in an adult framework for the most part. And there is horrible exploitation. There's horrible treatment. There's like vicious attacks by the likes of Perez Hilton. But a Lindsay Lohan can look back at something she did at 25, at 35, and be reflective in a way that a toddler who's toilet training that's being broadcast to the world, that's not fair.
Right. Yeah. No,
there's a huge, like, I'm not saying like anyone in this is like perfect or like should just be maligned, but that is so like such a huge cultural blind spot that I think we have.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting if parents listening to this, like, I wonder what the thought process is in terms of like when you allow your child to have an email account or a cell phone or, these different things that are markers of like entry point as personhood, like, are the moments when you have your own technology, like your own email account. But also like, do you show your children's face on Instagram? Like, how do you make determinations about that? Do you just show it to the close friends list or things like that? Like, those were certainly not concerns that our parents had to navigate.
We also see, right, in the chapter on Aaliyah, which is the one that comes right after Lindsay Lohan, the extent to which people have gone out of their way to recast a relationship that was hugely imbalanced, right? That was between an adult and a minor as something romantic, right? And I think this is where she makes a lot of valid points about a post-Me Too world. I'm constantly learning about, better ways to talk about different relationships, right? But even the fact that if you watch an old Law and Order SVU episode, a lot of the ways that they talk about non-consensual relationships would not even fly today, right? Like, there's been so much in the 20 plus years since Aaliyah first got famous. There's a lot in that chapter about R. Kelly and kind of him being somewhat punished, but also him being rehabilitated. That chapter made me so sad because she's a girl when a lot of things are happening to her and there's just so little protection. And I do make a distinction between that and, as horrible as some things are that have happened to like a Kim Kardashian, right? Or the exploitation of a China, they did happen to adults. And to think that no one in a child's life is protecting them is really sad.
Yeah, I mean, that was probably the most harrowing chapter of this book because you're just reading an extended description of child abuse. And, as you say, like her abusive relationship with R. Kelly is horrific. And the thing that makes it even more damning, and I'm sure was traumatic for her, is that so many people in her life who were adults who should have been taking care of her were not. And were basically, surrendering her right to consent, her right to be a child, in favor of her capacity to make money for them, whether it was her manager or family members or whoever. So yeah, that was incredibly sad to read. I think the parts of this book I think that chapter made sense. I think the parts of this book that are kind of all over the place are when she tries to make broader connections to issues affecting, quote, like women everywhere. And they're not wrong, but I think it's hard to try to bridge a gap between the story of someone like Jennifer Aniston and like women in the United States.
I found the Jennifer Aniston chapter to be the least compelling for a lot of reasons. And I want to bring up something that I read in the prologue. And I went back and I reread the prologue multiple times because this really stuck out to me and it kind of cast the entire book in a certain way. Towards the end of that prologue, the author writes, "I hope I have avoided the historian sin of applying the values of the present to the past." I don't think that's our sin. I had to read that multiple times.
Yeah, I find that to be and that's not something that she's just said. That's a thing a lot of people say about history, is that you can't apply the standards of the present to the past. And while that's literally true, I think there are some moral equivalencies that are fair to assign to the past. Like, for example, we would all agree child abuse is wrong, and it's reasonable to expect people in Aaliyah's lifetime understood that was wrong. So I don't understand like what she's talking about.
This made me think about a TikToker who I follow, and that's not what he's primarily known for. He's a professor of public history. And one of the things that he does over and over is he takes content made by a prominent house museum and he talks about how they go out of their way to not talk about the reality of slavery, which would have defined the experience of being on this place, on this plantation, for almost everyone who ever lived there, except for the titular head, who was once a president of this country. And this is kind of what he does. He interrogates their content over and over. And he's not doing that because Martha Washington might hear it from the grave. He's doing that to validate that holding people in bondage was wrong, is wrong, and to make sure that people know that if you just valorize the people who owned these houses, it tells a lot of people in this country, in this world, oh yeah, and public history isn't for you because that was okay. So right. I actually don't think we consider that a sin.
We don't. And also, like, people in George Washington's time knew that slavery was wrong. So part
Correct.
of what that also does is creates this fantasy land where it's like, well, back in 1776, like, it was a simpler time. They didn't know slavery was bad. Like, they just didn't know. So we can't be mad at them. And it's like, actually, people did know it was wrong. And they went through all kinds of intellectual gymnastics to justify it to themselves because they were relying on it economically. Like, that's what happened. And, the same thing is true of, the depiction of Perez Hilton in this book kind of made me nuts because I remember reading his website all the time. And the thing that actually turned me off of his site, this was before I knew I was gay, was that he used to out people routinely on his website.
Yes.
And always, like, it was that was a huge red flag to me, and I stopped reading his website. Again, I didn't even know I was gay at this point, but I was so turned off by that because it was like, and now he takes the pose of like, well, you know what, guys, it was the early aughts. We didn't know that you shouldn't out gay people who are not ready to talk about, that's part of their life. And it's like, yeah, guess what? We actually did know that was wrong. People knew that was wrong at that time. Not because MySpace was new and the internet was new and we didn't know how to navigate it. Like, there are certain things that, like, not are timeless, but that was something that he cannot claim he didn't know in 2004. Like, that just doesn't fly with me.
I think he's tried to rehabilitate himself by saying, like, all of this was fluid, kind of like an internet Apple Notes apology, right? We were all learning. But I remember, I would read his website periodically. I wasn't religiously devoted to it. And I remember after a while, it just felt really flat and boring for me because the only through line was that it was mean, right? You weren't learning insightful things about these people. It really was just mean. I'll say this. I love a newspaper article about what people have in their purse. I love knowing people's hobbies. I like seeing their houses. I like learning things about them. There was so little redeeming there. It was just viciously unkind about everyone.
Yeah. And even what's kind of interesting about the history of media and technology is, like, I do agree with her premise that the internet and this period of the internet gave rise to a lot of really irresponsible behavior because there was no regulation, or like public opinion hadn't turned on this kind of behavior, allegedly. But if you look at like Confidential magazine in the 50s, like, they were airing all kinds of celebrity gossip. It was just mean. And they were outing celebrities too. Like, they were talking about like Rock Hudson and people like that very early. So there's also just kind of this, through line of, like, people have been exploiting celebrities and blackmailing them and treating them terribly, like Marilyn Monroe and others, for decades, for hundreds of years. And so I think that's like the sad part of this book, is that in some ways I think it's it's like optimistic on her part to narrow it to this rough decade that she's focused on. But the sad thing is, like, so many of these, behaviors or traits persist.
The Amy Winehouse chapter really made me think, because I honestly had barely heard of Amy Winehouse until her passing. And then I remember that being an important cultural moment. I ended up looking up some videos and kind of trying to get myself into the headspace of remembering what it was like when she was very prominent. And something that's brought up in this book is that she'd become sort of distant and estranged from her family. And there's a line in here about how, the person who sings and like makes their living off of saying, like, they tried to make me go to rehab, but I said no. When that is your entire persona and you've lost a grip on your personal life and you have no privacy, your mother has to try to reach out to you through a gossip magazine.
Right.
Just a very like sad, really like very sad situation. And I hadn't listened to Amy Winehouse in a long time, but I put on a few of her songs, and really this made me think a lot about her being an actual casualty of this era in a way that is different from an Aaliyah, right? Aaliyah as being a person who was abused, but who dies in a freak accident ultimately. Janet, who loses her career. Kim, who, like a vulnerable moment is exposed, but she's able to flip it. China, right, who really goes through it. But thinking about Amy Winehouse and her self-destruction and her diseases that she had to live with, I think that's a very like somber turning point in this book, that then we kind of immediately go on this high with Kim Kardashian. Like, that gave me a little bit of of a turn. That was like a challenging leap for me to make between those two.
Yeah, I thought the positioning of the chapters was interesting, that it goes Amy Winehouse, Kim Kardashian, China, and then Jennifer Aniston. It was almost like she wanted to have like a more positive story between Amy and China, because to me, apart from Aaliyah, those are the darkest chapters in this book. And, Amy Winehouse, that was the toughest, I think, that and Aaliyah for me to read, because, there's been addiction in my family, and it's so hard when you love someone and they're, they have that disease and you're doing everything right and you're really trying to reach them and they just don't want it, like it's heartbreaking and it's so hard. And to imagine her at like the apex of her fame and to have her fame defined by, as you say, her addictions, and, how do you reach somebody like that? And ultimately they weren't able to, and it's just so sad. But the China chapter was interesting because I don't know that wrestlers often come into these stories about women in pop culture. Like, this is the first thing I've read that put her into that conversation.
No, and I'll admit I knew almost nothing about her going into this, so I feel like I got a real education. And this book really smartly situates the way that big wrestling culture taught people in reality TV a lot, and the way that those kind of slip into each other, and the prominence of Donald Trump in that world. I will fully admit that I was a huge fan of The Apprentice in the early 2000s when that first came out. That was a show that I absolutely loved to watch at the tail end of college and graduate school. And the way that certain celebrities really kind of got a second career, like a second life out of The Apprentice, there is still a big part of me that before 2020 and even now sees Donald Trump as the host of The Apprentice, which is like a really strange mental gymnastics for me because that's what I knew him as for years.
Yeah, and in a way I wish that was the only thing for which we knew him. Yeah, I mean it's interesting because the wrestling chapter brings out that it's a venue where the audience is in on the joke, so to speak, or like they understand that it's scripted, but they are kind of workshopping the script in message boards. Like that's where the internet comes in, and the company has to respond to that. So like China comes in. I remember China because my brother was into wrestling at her period of time. So I remember her with Triple H and that they were a couple. And then he ends up marrying the daughter of Vince McMahon. And that's like played out as a real storyline while it was also happening in real life. And, you know, as sad as that is, it also had real career implications for her, including the fact that like they had built so much on her not being, and she didn't want to be like a woman in a bikini wrestling. She wanted to be like a real wrestler who wrestled men. And because of those two things, then she gets like really othered within the wrestling world and cast out of it, and then ends up in a very tragic, you know, situation, very precarious financially, goes into porn and drugs, and obviously like hugely tragic. But it was interesting to kind of put that narrative of like someone who relies on a system to, you know, feed their career. And once you violate the unwritten rules of the system, you're really like let loose on your own. Like that was just very tragic to read.
Yeah, and how does that stack up for you against the way that this book ends? I know we kind of mentioned this book ends with Jennifer Aniston and the perception of her as a kind of sad woman, right? When she and her husband Brad Pitt divorce and he ends up marrying and then also divorcing Angelina Jolie, he kind of pulls himself out there as saying like he really wants a family, all he wants is a family, and she's presented as kind of having it all except for the fact that she denies her husband this thing, and there's a lot of rumors swirling. This book does like, I think it makes one of its biggest leaps by going from talking about that and the perception of her as being sort of like sad because she is childless to talking about reproductive choice. I'm not saying I don't buy it, but I'm kind of wondering if there was a different person we could have ended with.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, it's like by talking about Jennifer Aniston in those terms, you're replicating the ways that her life was reduced to those terms. So it's kind of like a problem that folds in on itself in a sense. But I think she wanted to have a conversation about like the struggle for women to have it all, even these exceptional women who have all this privilege. Like Jennifer Aniston ultimately gets reduced in the press, if not in real life, to like the woman who couldn't or wouldn't, you know, reproduce to please her husband because she still wanted an active career. And God only knows what really happened there. But, you know, also the fact that it was reduced to like people buying shirts that said Team Jen or Team Angie, and like, which totally like moves us away from the fact that the real villain there is Brad Pitt.
Right.
And
right.
you know what I mean? So it's like, I wish she had kind of talked about that more, which is like, you know, instead she's like, and Perez Hilton wore a Team Angie shirt because of course she would, like, she's a bad girl. And it's like, okay, but what about a system that immediately pits these women against each other while totally letting Brad Pitt off the hook? Like, I think he was like people's sexiest man alive in that period, and he didn't really have any kind of fall from grace or popularity. Instead, there was just like increased attention to Jennifer Aniston and criticism of her film choices, her boyfriend choices. And again, we have no clue what happened behind the scenes there, but I would imagine that would have been a more interesting framing of that person, of that moment in her public life. But instead it's like God, it's so hard. Like, women can't have it all. And like, it's even harder when women don't have reproductive rights. And it's like, yes, of course that's true. But I don't know if that's the connection I would have made there.
Her ultimate conclusion is that Jennifer resists, right, the boxes that people are trying to put her in, and that in itself is kind of a triumph. And she ends with a number of questions that say, did reality shows call women fat without compunction? The answer is like yes to all of these. Were life-threatening addictions treated as the stuff of primetime entertainment? Was everyone okay with R. Kelly? And she says, I was a participant, but I am shocked. And I think something that's changed in our own lifetime is our start time from historical event to historical criticism has shortened, I think, because of the internet. Like, I don't have to wonder what it was like to watch Amy do these interviews drunk because I can watch them, right? It's not the same as living through it in real time, even though I was alive in that period. And I think that's something that makes this book valuable, right? Like, if you like reading histories of our own time, this is a history of contemporary life. And especially if you grew up with the internet, it's so striking to me too. It's like, this is the world that we entered right after we kind of stopped being American Girl kids. Like, this is what came for us right after.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, I think my issue is like her sense of progress. I don't know if I believe in it as much as she does, but I mean, she says in the conclusion, the way celebrity women were once treated feels unimaginable now. And I don't really know if that's true. I mean, I think what's changed is the landscape of social media and having social media on phones, and, the internet culture has changed. I don't know if the way women have been treated has changed, especially because as she was writing this, reproductive rights have been stripped away, across the country. And that has not entered into this book. So I think that's what is a little bit hard for me to believe. But, I think overall, it's an important topic, and it is surreal to read about our own history in this way. But, it makes me happy to see like people like Renee Rapp, who gets up at like the GLAAD Awards and is like, free Palestine, and like, stop telling me I'm fat, and yeah, I'm a lesbian. It's like, okay, like that to me is like shocking. I don't think so. Like, Lindsay Lohan dating Samantha Ronson would not talk about her sexuality at all. And no one needs to put a label on their sexuality who doesn't want to. But she was clearly uncomfortable. Her people were clearly uncomfortable. And they were like, it's a fluke. Like, she's just experimenting. Whereas you have someone who now I consider young, Renee Rapp, being like, yep, I don't know, I'm figuring it out. Maybe I'm bi, maybe I'm a lesbian. Like, unafraid to comment about politics. That feels different. And I don't think she's an exception. I hope she becomes the rule, but that's where I see like a change over time.
The conclusion here is that we live beyond an impossibly vast gulf of technology and politics. That's what separates us from the early 2000s. And I'm not sure that we're there. I think I think we're actually still like floating in the space between those two things.
It's just as unregulated as it's ever been. Like, we're still like, Congress still has to like basically meekly be like, Mark Zuckerberg, do you think you could maybe, I don't know, like, could you please ban Nazis? And he's like, I don't know, guys. And like Elon Musk, like retweeting psycho like theories that are completely not true. I mean, that's where we are. And until that changes, I don't think we're going to see any big changes in the culture of the internet.
No, I do appreciate this history. I think if you like learning about not just these people, but really anything about the time that she calls the Wild West of the early aughts, or the upskirt decade, as this book was originally, or perhaps internationally marketed as, I think you should check it out. I think people would like it.
Yeah, I was very entertained by it. It made me think a lot, which I think is a credit to good books. So I've been thinking about it a lot since I read it. So I think for that alone, check it out. Get in touch with us. Tell us what you think.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you, everyone. And we'll talk to you soon.